All right, so let's get started. First question is kind of sort of a philosophical question. I'm going to start it off with broad strokes, and that is, what is a metaverse? You know, we have a lot of nebulous talk going on about what metaverses could be, sort of what we imagine them to be, but I kind of want to hear from you guys, like, specifically, like, the real application of a metaverse. What does it look like? What do you see coming in the next 5-10 years?
So I think this is like the question of the moment right now. And I think it's very difficult to parse out what is frankly like marketing bullshit with the reality of, so let's start with now, right? Like what are the core components of a metaverse? So I think when people are talking about the metaverse, they're talking about a couple of things, right? So firstly, and very simply, is you're talking about the transition from a 2D internet to a 3D internet, right? So the way in which people discover and consume information today is primarily presented in a 2D fashion, and we've seen, and I think it's primarily influenced on the one hand by gaming, and on the other hand by like macro developments in the world that have kept people separate from elements of the real world, separate from each other, that people have wanted to have a more immersive experience, a more interactive experience. So that's one component of it, is the transition from 2D to 3D. The second component of it is the transition to more and more immersive means of experiencing the internet, right? So how many people in this room own a VR headset? 3 people, right? So I mean, there's your answer right there. And I say that with no glee. Like when Spatial was founded, we first built Spatial on AR and VR headsets. But the reality of today is that most people, an AR headset generally is like $3,500. A VR headset's much less expensive, around $300, but they're not widely adopted yet. How many people here own a phone, right? Or use their web browser, right? So there's going to be an evolutionary transition from how people experience the internet today, which is primarily over a web browser or phone, into something much more immersive, right? And that could be a totally different world, VR, or it could be something that blends the digital world into the real world, like augmented reality. And then I think the third piece of this, which is what brings a lot of people here today, is I think about ownership and how we think about how information is shared and owned. And kind of during the last 2 waves of the internet, I think that's been a real area of tension, right? Like in the beginning, I think there was a really sort of like idyllic movement on the internet. Information should be free, everyone should have it. Then I think as we transition to Web 2.0, people realize like, okay, maybe there's some issues with that, right? Like you can start to pirate music, you could start to take someone's intellectual property and just throw it up on the internet. And now as we move to Web 3, there's this really interesting idea where we move back to like, well, what can the idea of owning something unique and rare look like on the internet? And how can we enable people to own things outright, to receive royalties for their work, to own fractional pieces. So there's a ton of information on the business model. And so I think the metaverse, my obviously not short definition, is I think it's the convergence in the short term of all these 3 trends into one thing. So I'll shut up now because you have several other brilliant people on this panel you should hear from, but let's start there.
Thank you.
Should we add something? Yeah, so from my perspective, it's exactly what you said. It's like transition from 2D internet into 3D, especially like we focus on social media. So especially here we see that this transition is something would have to happen. And yeah, and the third part we mostly focus on is this bridge that we can put physical things or new digital stuff into the metaverse, and we can own it and have this certificate of ownership, which is called NFT right now. So it's hard to add anything because you literally made a perfect definition of metaverse. And I would be the guy writing on Wikipedia. I would just copy paste what you said. So yeah, it was great.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, so I'm the most unlucky because the other 2 speakers already tell everything. But yes, coming back to this metaverse word. I mean, basically at the end of the day, metaverse is a buzzword. And like all of the buzzwords, they start losing meaning. You don't really understand anymore what are the real meaning. So there is a broad definition of metaverse that basically encompasses everything that is digital. I don't know, Twitter is a metaverse, Axie Infinity is a metaverse. An interesting metaverse actually because you can earn inside that. But actually, if you go to a more strict definition, of course, we go back to Snow Crash in 1991. So the metaverse is a 3D metaverse, so it's a virtual world. And I believe that, again, this is definitely a trend. So we are moving from books to mainframes to desktop to laptops, and then everybody now is browsing with a mobile phone. So there's a clear technological path that is bringing information from a 2D medium to the 3D medium. So I believe, and of course I'm biased because I'm building an AR metaverse, but the way that we are going to interact with information in the future the information will be in our optical field. And so this VR and AR technology are exactly the enabling technology to do that. That for the broader definition of metaverse, I think it's very important that we need to be able to live in the metaverse. And living in the metaverse means that we need to be able to earn in the metaverse. And so doing something meaningful. Of course, playing is something meaningful, but probably we also need to have a way to support our physical existence over there. So since we invest so much time in this broad definition metaverses, I guess that we are in a very important moment in history because we don't want to be in a dystopian future where we are in a metaverse owned by a single company. I will not give the name. And so it's very important that, I mean, this Web3 movement, so this movement in which we not only can interact with information, produce information, but we can also own digital assets. So we can own part of these metaverses. This is very important, and I hope, I mean, that not only this small community that is here will embrace this movement, but also the broader public will do that. This is very important because we want to move away from the dystopian future where we are in meta owned by somebody. Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you guys. Great insights. I'm actually going to skip around in my questions a little bit because this conversation sort of dovetailed into another one. So what I'd like to ask you now is regarding the technological possibilities as well as limitations of AR, VR technology, as well as any potential bottlenecks you see in the adoption to these technologies, sort of a mass adopted way of experiencing the metaverse. Do you have any thoughts on that? Are there technological challenges that you're dealing with right now?
Yeah, I mean, can we hear me? Yeah, oh, I think we got it this time. All right, woo, can I get a round of applause for the microphone? I love it. Thank you, AV team. Yes, so first off, I think there are some technological challenges that are shared between VR and AR and some that are very particular to one versus the other. At the end of the day, the challenge is really simple, right? How do you make it comfortable and compelling to wear a computer on your face? It's not an easy thing to do. You need to balance a couple of things, right? You need to balance comfort, that this is lightweight, doesn't make you sweat, you almost forget it's on your face to some extent. You need to balance computing power, right? And battery power, right? So to what extent can I actually facilitate a really compelling experience? So that requires a lot of computing power. And then battery power, like to what extent can I actually have this experience for long periods of time without needing to take it off? And there's like a trilemma there because you could usually have like 2 of those 3 things maybe, but never all of them at any one time. And so that's really difficult. So some of the innovations that are being worked on right now to solve this, right? So some of it is on the chipset side, on the literal the fabrication side. So companies like Qualcomm, for example, or even Apple with like their new M1 chip are trying to figure out, how can I build even more powerful computers that consume less power and that could fit into smaller and smaller devices. I think a second maybe competing trend is there's probably another school of thought that says, well, what if you didn't need to pack all the computing power into the device? What if the computing power could live on a server at the edge or in the cloud, and you actually just stream the experience very, very quickly to the device. So in order for that to happen, there needs to either be really, really high bandwidth local streaming technology, right? So streaming something from your phone to your headset or from a server to your headset, or there needs to be like really widely available high bandwidth internet, right? So people talk about 5G. Another buzzword, if you're playing buzzword bingo, I think we hit Metaverse, we hit 5G. Somewhere, someone at a Fortune 500 company just had like their birthday because we've hit so many marketing buzzwords. But that's another thing. And then I think a third thing people explore a lot, and this is probably more in the case of AR, but a little bit in VR, is like, think about it this way. If you're putting a screen in front of your face for hours at a time, that's really exhausting for your eyes. And so, people are basically trying to solve two big, I think, optical challenges. One, or three really. Like, one is the field of view. How do I allow you to have a really, really immersive experience where you're not just looking at a small box? Two is, how do I make that comfortable for you? Because if you're rendering everything at the same resolution right in front of your eyes, you feel like your eyes are literally gonna like burn off. It's very, very exhausting. And then the third thing, which is particularly like an AR problem, is how do I render all this so it actually looks like it's in the real world and not just a screen? And when you try and do that, you start to sacrifice some of the other things. So if you've used an AR headset today, the most realistic looking ones have very small field of views because it's very, a lot of them use waveguide technology, which doesn't, it's basically a series of mirrors that make it look like something's real. But there's these big trade-offs of like, the better the waveguide, often the smaller the field of view. So like, when you talked about wanting to live in the metaverse, right? So if that requires some sort of new optical system, a computer on your face to get there, it's gonna take a bunch of years to solve all these problems in parallel, which is why you're seeing VR headsets today only generally adopted for gaming, because you basically need an insanely compelling experience to motivate people to overlook some of these problems that they've experienced so far.
Okay, so I would just add to this that another technological issue is how we're going to control this metaverse.
Yeah.
So, for example, right now we are working with a startup which is the biggest decentralized marketplace for biosignals. I don't know if you know what biosignal is, but it's literally when you're thinking about something and it's going through your brain, and we can read those biosignals. And for example, they already can do something like, when you're thinking about elephant, they can put the elephant on a screen, so they can read what you're really thinking about. And then you can use, just by thinking, you can control your metaverse avatar. But the case here is not about the technology, but the case here is we need to have amazingly big database of those all biosignals, so we can program it and it can be accurate for what you're doing. That's why they are building like super big decentralized. It's like same with Tesla and the autopilot. So more data you have, they are before everyone because they had a lot of data about self-driving. And here the case is exactly the same. So you need a lot of data. You need the biosignals from all the people in the world, probably, and then you can make it really accurate. So yeah, that's another thing I believe will come in like next 3 years. So you will be able to control your metaverse avatar just by thinking. And the fifth thing I think it's really important about metaverse is like just user adoption, so just educating people, because sometimes we got technology, like we got NFT right now, or we got crypto, which I think all the DeFi system is great. And what is staying between everyone using crypto and most of the people still are not using it? So what we're also doing is, because we are working with celebrities, we generally we're tokenizing celebrities and influencers. So we, for example, doing 3D scans of them, like their 3D avatars, dividing it into NFTs, and people can buy it. So, what we see is 90% of people who are buying those NFT, they pay with credit card. And they never had a wallet before, so we keep it NFTs custodial for them. So this another thing is, once we got this technology, because there are already projects which have it, we still need get on board people, so we need to spread like metaverse adoption, NFT adoption, and stuff. So there are like two things I would add to what you said before.
Yeah, so I will just add a little bit to the technological challenges, especially with augmented reality, that is my specific field. So adding to what was already said, so the computing power and the optics, there is another optic problem that, of course, is also lighting. So, for example, if you try Magic Leap, it's an amazing device. The field of view is quite good, but still you have a bulky GPU that you need to bring around. And outside it doesn't work because you are competing with sunlight. So there are still some technological challenges that need to be solved. I'm quite optimistic about that because, of course, we all know what's the technological trend and how is the speed and exponential speed of this. So I would not be very surprised if in 5-10 years we have widespread devices of this kind. But there is another challenge regarding specifically augmented reality. So in our case, for example, we're building this platform for geolocalized AR. So we need to augment physical locations. And right now, to augment physical locations, to know where you are, you use GPS. And of course, GPS has huge limitations because outside is 3 to 6 meters precise and inside doesn't work. So this is also actually an opportunity because basically in order to overcome this problem, you need to map locations. So, for example, in our case, what we did, we built some algorithms that taking pictures of location, you create a 3D map, and then you have a neural network that relocates you when it sees again the location. So this is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, for example, for startups like us or others, that can create, again, a job in the metaverse for people going around and scanning location and not having a single company owning that, because those people can create 3D maps that can be NFTs and they can own those. So, I mean, those challenges at the end of the day are also big opportunities, I guess.
Could I build on what you actually said? Because you inspired me. I'm with such inspiring panelists. It's a beautiful thing. I think you're touching on something that's really interesting, right? So, in the example that you just gave, right? This used to be, they used to call it the AR cloud, but the idea of there's a shared map of the world, and when your device wants to display content, it needs to know where it is in the world, right? So there are, you mentioned one really interesting challenge, which is like, how do you map the world and then know you are? But then when you ended, you mentioned something really important, which is like, who owns that information? Yeah. Where is it stored? And how is it accessed? And this dovetails to your point, which is actually a really interesting challenge. So when you're at a conference like this, right? And I think like, can we all get like fists in the air? Everyone here generally believes in like decentralization. I'm like a big crowd engager person. Like people generally believe in it, but like in the talk before this, at the very end, which I appreciated, someone was like, "Oh, you're very bullish, but what are the bear?" And I think it's very important to look at both sides of everything. And in this case, one of the downsides of decentralization, frankly, it creates challenges around performance. For example, so if you built a map of the world, but that map wasn't owned, or stored by a single entity, but maybe it's everyone owns their own data and it's stored all over the place. Well, that means now when you're trying to figure out where you are and you're trying to index that map, you're not just going to one server or one copy of the same map, stored at a server, locally to you. That information might be stored in a lot of different places, right? And so that could slow down how quickly you're able to index that and have your experience. So there's an interesting push and pull with the metaverse where users want a really seamless experience, but they also want the protection, right? And all of the affordances that decentralization enables. And sometimes there are trade-offs. And that's going to be like a really interesting thing that we have to negotiate. Like we encounter that, like, here's another example, right? So people make NFT galleries in Spatial. And we talk to creators and collectors all the time, and we're like, well, how do you want that to work, right? There are sort of like three possibilities. We can take your NFT, whether it's a 2D asset, a 3D asset, and we could like cache it on our server temporarily, but we can, use your token of ownership to give you control on our server. That's a fairly centralized version of decentralization. We could always delete the file once you're done using it and like pull it in from like IPFS. But again, there are some people that think, well, that's also not decentralized enough, right? Because then it's like all you're storing is some metadata on chain, but like this actual file still exists somewhere else for someone else to take. Or you could like try and store the whole file on chain, but there are obviously huge limitations to that right now, and that's why when you see like these projects where everything is truly on chain, the most they're able to do is have like a very simply pixelated PFP or something like that, because it's a very simple piece of information. But when you're talking about like a really immersive world, like storing that on chain and then loading that really quickly, like, you know, a lot of the more popular blockchains that people leverage today, like the computing power just isn't available. The protocol isn't developed enough to allow a user experience built on top of that to load that information really, really quickly. So I'm just teeing up the general and I think very interesting problem of like decentralization, very good for ownership, very good for security, but creates challenges on the front end in terms of the user experience, and that, you know, creates difficulties for us who are trying to create the metaverse, because it's like we want to both empower the creators and collectors of the world to, you know, have things be as decentralized as they want them to, but if we're not empowering the audience to have this seamless experience that they want, you know, I want to see your piece of art really, really quickly, I want to experience your 3D building really, really quickly, then that will diminish the value of your 3D asset, because the experience we're trying to facilitate around it can't be enabled in a really seamless way. So that's just a really interesting problem that I think all of us are probably trying to sort through right now from a technological experience of how to negotiate the ups and downs of the two worlds.
Yeah, I can just add there are like some really cool blockchains now, like for example Terranoa, which allow you to store data, and it's like for 1 gigabyte you pay like $8, something like this. So like comparing to Ethereum, I was once calculating how much it would cost to store a picture, a PFP picture on Ethereum, and I think it was like over $10 million just to store it on chain. So yeah, $8 for 1 gigabyte, it looks cool. So yeah, there's already like a lot of chains, a lot of really cool projects which are decentralized, and they are like, you know, their goal is to store data. So I think it's about like a few years and it will be solved, like hopefully.
Yeah, just closing on that. I mean, I think that theoretical problem is very well stated. But what I see happening at the end of the day is that this problem of ownership and of the actual existence of the asset lives in kind of two separated layers. So it's kind of accepted in the community right now that you do not store, of course, the asset in the blockchain. You store a hash of it, and you have the rest of the file stored maybe on IPFS or even maybe in a centralized server sometime. Of course, the centralized servers is much more, better performances instead in terms of delivering the asset. So yes, theoretically, I think this is an important problem, but what I see at least like a consensus in the community that is not really, at least in the decentralization maximalist perspective, this is not really, doesn't look like perceived like a big problem. Like for example, for NFTs, we know that CryptoPunks is one of the only few that actually are stored on chain. Of course, they can do that because it's a bitmap, basically. But for the rest, it looks like it's commonly accepted that the ownership needs to be protected with the higher assurances of blockchain, while the underlying file doesn't need this war chest of protection. But you know, this is a very interesting point, and we will see how will this evolve. Absolutely, yeah.
Awesome, guys. Thank you so much. You know, it's a good panel when you go through all of your allotted time and you've only managed to ask 2 or 3 questions, but that's okay. I think we have time to ask maybe 2 questions from the audience. Like 2 minutes? 2 minutes. Anybody got a question for these wonderful gentlemen up here? Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry?
NFT and games, and actual games.
NFT games. Your thoughts on NFT games? In-game.
Sorry.
In-game. NFTs and games.
Stand by. Just NFT and games. It's going to be QA.
Yeah, okay, so I'm not sure if I understand the question. So you're asking about NFT in games, like generally about NFT in games. Yes, yeah, I believe everything what you own in games will be connected to some certificate of ownership, which will be NFT. So basically, the future of gaming is into NFT. If you got character in, I don't know, whatever game, it will be an NFT. That's exactly what we're doing right now with celebrities. So when we're scanning them and we're doing those 3D avatars, because you can scan a person right now so fast. We get this technology that we can scan everyone in like 30 seconds. Maybe it's not perfect, then we can do some correction. The hairs are always a big problem, so it takes more time, but you can model it pretty fast. So yeah, all of those avatars, they need to have some ownership certificate as well. All the items you will put into game or metaverse. So how I imagine it, you want to put your dog into metaverse, you need to own it somehow. So you will have NFT for your dog in the metaverse, and exactly same will be for all assets you got in games. So yeah, so basically all the games will be connected to NFT, and NFT will be the main like certificate of ownership for everything.
If I can expand a little bit on this and generalize, basically we need to think about NFTs as the building blocks of the open metaverses, because if an object is an NFT, it exists in open metaverses. So if you have, a Sandbox asset, you can bring that Sandbox asset in any other metaverse. This is the way you can really own it. So it's totally logical, that this is applied also to gaming. NFT is a huge revolution, and I guess that we are just starting to understand it now, especially applied to metaverses, of course.
I'll say something for a change that's pretty short. I think the one thing that's interesting is that I think in the past, you'd basically like build the game, build the user experience, and then I think like the ownership dynamics were kind of layered on after, like once people figured out what people cared about. I think what's pretty interesting right now in the NFT world is that things are flipped. Like a lot of projects are like selling assets or parts of the game before the game even exists as a way to sort of like validate. So like the game itself is really like ownership, and then the actual like experience sort of becomes secondary. And I think that's just a really interesting trend. Like Spatial, we haven't done that. Like we built our world and now we're figuring out kind of the monetization. So just something I think to think about for yourselves. There's like, what do you believe in? Like, do you believe that the game should exist first, or do you believe in sort of like buying and owning the parts of the game and then having it being built to catch up with what you own?
All right.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you guys so much. Jacob Loewenstein, Bartek, Sibiga, Diego, Tommaso. Nice to meet you all. Thank you for being with us.
Great moderator. Visit spatial.io. I love shilling.
Need to plug anything, guys?
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys.